Tonight's stories hide more than fear. They hide puzzles buried in the Canadian wilderness. As you listen, pay attention. In each story, there's something that doesn't fit. A detail that shouldn't exist. A clue left behind by whoever or whatever caused these encounters. Some of these mysteries have explanations. Others never received one. Your challenge is simple. Try to solve them before I reveal what investigators, witnesses, and experts believe is really happening. Welcome to Vesper Shroud. Let's see how many of these nightmares you can decode. Story 1. Frozen Faces of Lake Superior. I saw a human face pressed against the underside of the ice on Lake Superior. Its mouth moving, whispering words I couldn't quite hear, and I knew immediately that what I was witnessing was something that shouldn't exist in any rational world. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been ice fishing on Lake Superior for 23 years. I know that lake better than I know most people. I understand its moods, its seasons, its dangers. I respect its power and its beauty. I've taught my children how to fish its frozen surface, how to read the ice, how to survive if the conditions turn treacherous. I thought I knew everything Lake Superior could throw at me until the faces started appearing. It was January of this year, 2024, and I was out on the ice with my fishing buddy Tom near the Canadian side of the lake, in the area between Thunder Bay and the U.S. border. The ice was solid, at least 3 feet thick, the kind of ice that could hold a truck. The weather was brutally cold, -25 Celsius, the kind of cold that made exposed skin freeze in minutes. We set up our shelter, drilled our holes, and were settling in for what should have been a routine day of fishing. Tom was inside the shelter brewing coffee. I was standing outside, looking out at the vastness of the frozen lake, when I noticed something unsettling beneath the ice near my fishing hole. There was a shape, a human shape. At first, I thought it was just a distortion in the ice, a pattern created by light refraction or an air bubble trapped in the frozen water. But as I looked more closely, I realized it was definitely a face, a human face, suspended just beneath the surface of the ice, looking upward at me. The face was pale, bloated, with the appearance of someone who had been in cold water for an extended period. The eyes were open, staring directly up at me, and the mouth was moving, opening and closing, as if the face was trying to speak. I called Tom out of the shelter. When he saw what I was seeing, he went pale himself. He wanted to leave immediately, to get off the ice, to drive back to the mainland. But I was compelled to investigate further. I needed to understand what I was looking at. I took my ice saw and began cutting a larger hole in the ice, widening my fishing hole so I could see the face more clearly. As I cut, the face beneath the ice seemed to move, following my movements, its eyes tracking my position. And I could hear sounds coming from beneath the ice, whispered words, a voice that was trying desperately to communicate something. The whispers were barely audible, but they were there. Words being formed by a mouth that was moving beneath the ice, expressing something with urgency and desperation. I leaned closer to the ice, trying to make out what was being said, trying to understand the message the face was attempting to convey. And then Tom grabbed my arm and pulled me backward. He said I needed to stop, that we needed to leave immediately, that whatever was happening on that ice was not something we should be investigating further. But I resisted. I was too curious, too compelled by the presence of the face beneath the ice. I wanted to understand what it was and what it wanted. Tom didn't wait for me. He packed up the fishing equipment and left, drove back toward Thunder Bay without me. He said later that he felt an overwhelming compulsion to leave, a sense of danger so intense that he couldn't overcome it even to wait for his friend. I remained on the ice. I continued cutting at the hole, trying to enlarge it enough to see the face completely. As I cut, more faces appeared beneath the ice. First 2, then 5, then more than I could count. They filled the space beneath the ice around my fishing hole. All of them pale and bloated and moving, all of them with their mouths open, all of them whispering words that I still couldn't quite make out. The whispers merged together into a kind of chorus, multiple voices overlapping, creating a sound that was horrifying and hypnotic at the same time. I felt myself being pulled toward the hole in the ice, drawn by the voices, compelled to lean closer and closer to the opening. I should have left. I should have followed Tom's example and gotten off the ice immediately. But I was in the grip of something that overrode my survival instincts, something that made me need to understand what the faces wanted, what they were trying to communicate. I heard my name being whispered from beneath the ice, not shouted, not called out loudly, but whispered, in a voice that was almost affectionate, almost intimate. Marcus, my name, spoken by a face that had never met me, a face that had been frozen beneath the surface of Lake Superior, expressing knowledge of my identity and some kind of interest in my presence. I ran. I grabbed what I could of my fishing equipment and I ran toward the shore, ran across the ice in the terrifying cold, ran with the whispers following me, the voices of dozens of dead people calling my name, begging me to return, telling me that they knew who I was, that they'd been waiting for me specifically. When I reached the shore, I collapsed in the snow, my body shaking from cold and from fear. A search and rescue team found me 3 hours later when Tom reported that I'd been left on the ice and didn't return. I was hypothermic and incoherent. They rushed me to the hospital in Thunder Bay. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive, that another hour in those conditions and I would have frozen to death. They kept me in the hospital for a week, treating frostbite and exposure while I recovered from the physical trauma of my experience. But I never recovered from the psychological trauma. I told the authorities what I'd seen. The RCMP sent divers to investigate. They found nothing beneath the ice except water and the normal debris that accumulates on a lake bottom. There were no bodies, no faces, no indication that anything unusual existed beneath the surface of Lake Superior. The official conclusion was that I experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by extreme cold exposure, that my brain had created the visions of faces as a side effect of severe hypothermia. My experience was classified as a medical phenomenon, and the investigation was closed. But I knew what I'd seen. I spent the next several months researching the history of Lake Superior. I contacted other ice fishers, other people who spent time on the frozen surface of the lake. And I discovered that my experience was not unique. Over the past 20 years, at least 30 people had reported seeing faces beneath the ice. The reports came from different locations around the lake, different times of year, different weather conditions. But the descriptions were always similar. Human faces, pale and bloated, moving beneath the ice, whispering messages to the people above. Most of these reports had been dismissed, attributed to hallucinations or stress-induced psychological episodes. But when I compiled all the reports, when I examined the pattern, I realized something horrifying. The faces were moving, not randomly, but with intention, with awareness, with coordination. They seemed to be spreading across the lake, appearing in new locations, making contact with new people. And based on the timeline of reports, they seemed to be accelerating, appearing more frequently with each passing year. I also discovered something about the lakes where these faces had been reported. They all had histories of drowning deaths, particularly deaths that occurred in winter, deaths where bodies were never recovered. Lake Superior alone had over 300 documented drowning deaths, many of them occurring in winter, many of them occurring in the deep, cold water where bodies would be preserved but never retrieved. I believe the faces were the spirits of the drowned, trapped beneath the ice, trying to communicate with the living, trying to make contact with people on the surface, trying to express something important about their deaths or their conditions. I returned to Lake Superior in February, despite warnings from my family and my doctor. I couldn't stay away. I felt compelled to return, to make contact with the faces again, to finally understand what they wanted from me specifically. I set up my fishing equipment in a different location, miles from where I had my first encounter. But the faces found me. Within minutes of cutting through the ice, they were there, pressing against the underside of the frozen surface, their eyes open, their mouths moving, whispering my name. This time, I stayed. This time, I listened carefully to what they were trying to say. And slowly, gradually, I began to understand their message. They were telling me that they were cold. They were telling me that they were lonely. They were telling me that they'd been alone beneath the ice for years, decades, some of them for over a century. They were telling me that they remembered what warmth felt like, what air felt like, what it felt like to be alive and not trapped in the darkness below the frozen surface. And they were asking me to join them. The voices became increasingly insistent, increasingly persuasive. They told me that the ice was thin in certain locations, that all I had to do was walk to one of those locations and step through, and I would be with them. I would understand their experience. I would no longer be alone in the world. I felt myself being pulled toward those thin spots. I knew where they were. The voices were telling me exactly where to find them. I started walking across the ice, following the directions whispered from beneath the frozen surface. moving toward the places where the faces promised I could join them. It took my daughter calling the rescue team for the second time that saved my life. She had tracking information on my truck. The rescue team found me standing on the ice, my feet positioned at the edge of a crack, about to step through into the water below. They said I was in some kind of trance, that I didn't respond to their shouts or their warnings. They pulled me away from the edge. They brought me back to the mainland. They admitted me to a psychiatric facility where I spent 3 months receiving treatment for what doctors classified as severe psychotic episodes with suicidal ideation. I am no longer on the psychiatric medications. I convinced my doctor that I was stable, that I recovered from whatever psychological episode 1 experienced. But the truth is I am still hearing the voices. Every night, in my dreams, I hear the whispers of the drowned beneath Lake Superior. Every day, I feel the compulsion to return to the ice, to walk out into the cold, to finally accept the invitation to join them in the darkness below. They've been fighting that compulsion for months now. Some days are harder than others. Some days, I'm sitting in my apartment in Thunder Bay and I can feel the pull so strongly that I have to force myself to not drive to the lake. Some days, I understand exactly what the drowned want from me and why they were so focused on my specific participation in whatever they attempting to accomplish. They recollecting people, they regathering souls, gathering consciousness, building something beneath the ice. And they want me because they made direct contact, because they heard their voices, because they've been marked as someone who understands their presence and their nature. Lake Superior is not safe in winter. If you ice fish, if you spend time on the frozen surface, if you cut holes to access the water below, you need to understand that you might see something beneath the ice that will change your life forever. You might see faces, you might hear voices, and you might feel yourself being called into the darkness, invited to join a community of the drowned that exists in the cold depths. Some people accept that invitation. Some people walk out onto the ice and simply disappear into cracks that appear beneath their feet. Some people never make it off the lake. But some people, like me, manage to resist. Some people manage to survive the contact and return to the surface. And those people are left with the knowledge that the drowned are down there, waiting, gathering, preparing for something, calling out to the living, one person at a time, slowly building a presence that grows stronger with each passing winter. I don't know what they want. I don't know what they rebuilding. But I know that eventually, the ice will become thin enough that the barrier between their world and ours will break completely. And when that happens, Lake Superior won't be a place of beauty and tradition anymore. It will be a place of absolute terror and darkness. The faces are still down there. They are still whispering. And every winter, they seem to call a little bit louder. Story 2. Haunted Cabin of Algonquin Park. I'm telling you what happened because someone needs to know the truth. This is a horrifying account of what my group discovered in the remote wilderness of Algonquin Park, and why none of us have been the same since. If they ever felt like something was watching you from the darkness, if they ever experienced that creepy, unsettling sensation of being followed when you read completely alone, then you need to hear this. 3 of us drove up to Algonquin Park on a freezing October night. The sky was black, not dark, actually black, like the universe had swallowed all light. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Something felt wrong from the moment we entered the park. That eerie, chilling feeling you get when your body knows something your mind hasn't processed yet. The trees seemed to lean toward the road, their bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers. We were there to explore the backcountry. Just 3 guys seeking an adventure, or so we thought. We had supplies, a map, and what we believed was enough experience. We didn't know that certain places in this world hold secrets. Terrifying secrets, the kind that change you permanently. The hiking trail was unsettling even in daylight. Fog rolled across the forest floor, thick and creeping, obscuring everything beneath our knees. My friend Marcus kept saying he heard something moving parallel to us through the trees. Not an animal, something disturbing that moved like a person, but wrong. The way it moved was nightmare fuel, jerky, unnatural, like something learning how to walk for the first time. I told him it was just his imagination, but my voice sounded hollow and unconvincing even to myself. We found the cabin around dusk on the second day. It sat in a clearing that shouldn't have existed. The trees formed a perfect circle around it, as if they'd been arranged that way deliberately. The cabin itself was old, weathered, abandoned for decades at least. But here is what made my skin crawl. It was relatively clean. No broken windows. The door hung slightly open, inviting us inside like a mouth frozen mid-scream. We entered because we were stupid and curious and didn't understand that some places are meant to stay sealed. The interior was sparse but organized. A table, a cot with a sleeping bag, a fireplace with ash so old it had turned gray. But the walls, God, the walls. That is when the horrifying truth became impossible to ignore. They were covered in carvings. Thousands of them, carved deep into the wood with something sharp and desperate. Names, dates, symbols we couldn't understand. And then the message that made my blood turn to ice. The message that explained everything. It follows US. It was carved over and over again, repeating on every wall, each letter dug deeper than the last, as if the person carving had become more frantic, more terrified, more sure of what was stalking them. The desperation in those marks was palpable. I could feel the fear that had driven someone to cover every surface with that single, chilling phrase. It follows us, not follows me, us, multiple people, all of them together, and whatever was pursuing them hadn't to stop. Not for 1 second. Marcus pointed to a corner where the carvings became almost violent, gouged so deeply that splinters of wood lay scattered on the floor. Look, he whispered. The scratches spelled out words. Can. T sleep. Watching. Always watching. The final words trailed off into random marks, as if the person carving had broken down, unable to continue. I found a journal buried under the cot. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting inconsistent and sometimes illegible, like it was written during moments of intense fear. The first entry was dated 32 years ago. A group of 6 hikers had set out from the same trailhead we used. They intended to spend a week in the backcountry, exploring and camping. What they encountered instead was something that defied explanation, something nightmarish and relentless. According to the journal, they first noticed they were being followed on their second night. One of the group members, a man named David, woke up convinced something was outside their tent. Not an animal, a presence. The entries described it with a terrifying detail that made it feel absolutely real. They couldn't see it clearly, but they could sense it. They could hear it breathing just beyond the firelight. They could feel its eyes on them when darkness fell. That unsettling, creepy sensation of being observed by something intelligent and patient and raw. They tried to leave. They packed up and started hiking back toward civilization, but the feeling never stopped. The horrifying realization hit them gradually. Whatever was following them didn't care about the direction they moved. It came from in front of them. It came from behind. It came from the sides. It was everywhere and nowhere. The fear described in those pages was the kind of pure, primal terror that breaks people. One of the hikers, a woman named Sarah, became convinced that if she looked directly at it, she would die. So she refused to turn around. She walked forward for 2 days straight, not eating, not resting, convinced that any moment of attention paid to the thing behind her would be fatal. The journal entries became increasingly disturbing. They eventually built a shelter and barricaded themselves inside, hoping that whatever was following them would lose interest or move on. It didn't. Night after night, they heard it moving around the cabin. The scratching sounds at the walls. The breathing that didn't sound quite human. The moans that might have been an animal or might have been something worse. And the most chilling part, they could hear it trying to imitate them. It would copy their voices, speaking words they had just spoken moments before, but distorted and wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. This is where the story becomes truly nightmare fuel. According to David, his final entries, 3 of the 6 hikers simply disappeared. Not escaped, disappeared. One moment they were inside the cabin, and the next they were gone, as if they had never existed. The others heard them scream, a sound so horrifying that David wrote, "I will never forget that sound." It was not human suffering. It was something worse. It was joy. Whatever took them was happy. The remaining 3 stayed in that cabin for 17 days, carving warnings into every wall, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening to them. The journal entries describe an escalating paranoia that might have been justified. They began to suspect that one of the thing's victims had come back. Changed. Wrong. Operating with intentions that seemed designed to break them psychologically. The entries describe arguments about whether they could trust each other anymore, whether one of them was still human or if something else was wearing their skin. The journal ended abruptly. Mid-sentence, David's final words were, "It knows we know. It's coming inside now," and that was it. Nothing else, just the blank pages that followed. My hands were shaking when I closed that journal. Marcus was standing by the window, staring out into the darkness that had fallen while we were inside. I asked him what he was looking at. He didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally turned around, his face was pale, terrified. "How long have we been in here?" he asked. I checked my watch. We entered at dusk. It was now just past midnight. 6 hours gone. We could have sworn it was only 30 minutes. That's when we heard it. The sound came from outside the cabin, from the darkness that pressed against the walls. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the building. But the footsteps were wrong. They came from multiple directions simultaneously. Left side, right side, front, back. Too many feet to belong to one thing, but moving with a synchronized, eerie coordination that suggested a single consciousness directing them. And underneath the footsteps, we heard breathing. Labored, hungry, familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. Marcus gasped. "That breathing," he whispered. "I know that breathing. That's David. That's David. It's breathing from the voice memo he was recording." How is that possible? My third friend, Tom, was pointing at the walls with a shaking hand. "Look," he choked out. New carvings were appearing. Deep gouges in the wood, emerging as we watched, letters forming without anything touching them. The wood was splitting open, splinters flying, and carved into the walls in our own handwriting was a message. "It follows us. It follows you. It will always follow you." We ran. I don't remember exiting the cabin or how we made it back to the trailhead. But we did. We ran through that forest in total darkness, branches tearing at our faces, our screams lost in the sound of something moving through the trees behind us. The horrifying thing was that the faster we ran, the faster it ran. And it never made a sound except for that breathing, that unsettling, creepy breathing that sounded like it was learning how to live with stolen lungs. We made it back to civilization. We reported what we found to the park rangers. They discovered the cabin and the carvings, exactly as we described. But here is what they told us that still haunts me. The last official record of that cabin. This discovery was 32 years ago. The rangers had found it then too. The carvings were already there, already complete. The journal we found had already been written, already ending mid-sentence in the exact same way. No trace of those 6 hikers was ever found. The official report classified the carvings as the work of disturbed individuals engaged in an elaborate hoax, a psychological event, a mass delusion. But they didn't explain how 6 people could vanish without a trace or how the carvings seemed to match the handwriting patterns of multiple distinct individuals across decades. I need you to understand something crucial, something absolutely terrifying. It's been 4 months since we found that cabin. The unsettling, eerie feeling of being followed hasn't stopped. None of us can sleep for long without waking up convinced that something is standing over our bed, breathing that labored, hungry breathing. They all started to notice something that makes my skin crawl with fear. Our voices are changing. The way we speak, the cadence, it's becoming more synchronized. Like 3 separate people are being slowly merged into something singular. Last week, I heard its voice coming from my apartment. I live alone. The voice was Tom. But it was reciting something I said to him 3 months ago, word for word, but distorted and wrong. When I searched my apartment, there was nothing there, but written on my bathroom mirror in condensation was a message in handwriting that looked like mine. "It follows us. The nightmare isn't over. The horror is escalating. I don't know how much longer I can resist the feeling that something is replacing parts of me. That whatever was in that cabin has followed me home and is patiently waiting for the right moment to step inside completely. This is my warning to anyone who reads or hears this. If you planning a trip to Algonquin Park, as backcountry, know that there are places that shouldn't to be explored. Terrifying places, disturbing, chilling places where something old and patient and cruel is waiting. And if you ever find yourself hearing your own voice speaking words you haven't said yet, if you notice time slipping away in ways you can't explain, if you feel that presence watching you from the darkness, remember, it doesn't matter if you run. It doesn't matter where you go. It follows. Story 3. Vancouver Gastown Executioner. I saw something that night that I still cannot explain. Something horrifying that changed everything I understood about reality. This is the true account of what happened to me in Vancouver, this Gastown district, and why I can never go back to that neighborhood again. If you have ever felt watched by something unseen, if you have ever experienced that creepy, bone-chilling sensation of being in the presence of pure evil, then you need to hear this testimony. Because what I encountered is still out there, and it is still hunting. I moved to Vancouver in late September for a job in the tech industry. A normal career move, a fresh start in a new city. I found an apartment in a converted warehouse near Gastown, the historic district with its brick buildings and cobblestone streets. The rent was cheap, the location was convenient, and I had no idea I was moving into the epicenter of something terrifying, something horrifying that locals whispered about but never explained to newcomers. The first few weeks were uneventful. I went to work, came home, explored the neighborhood on weekends. Gastown was charming during the day. The steam clock, the vintage shops, the restaurants and bars filled with tourists taking pictures. But there was something about the neighborhood at night that felt wrong. An eerie sensation I could not quite put into words. The streets seemed darker than they should be, even with the streetlights. The shadows were too deep, too alive, too aware. I learned about the history one night while sitting in a bar. An older man, a longtime resident, mentioned something in passing. He said the neighborhood had been built on top of an execution ground. That during the 1880s, there had been public hangings in Gastown. Dozens of them. The gallows had stood near what is now a busy intersection, and hundreds of people had gathered to watch criminals meet their fate. The man's voice became distant, unsettling, as he described how the bodies would remain hanging for hours sometimes, as a warning to others. The way he spoke about it made my skin crawl. He seemed genuinely frightened, even after all these years. I asked him if anything strange happened in the neighborhood now. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then he said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He told me that people reported seeing a figure near the old execution site. A hooded figure that appeared at night, standing motionless, watching passers-by with an intensity that was absolutely terrifying. The figure never moved quickly. It never threatened anyone directly. It simply stood there, observing, its presence creating an atmosphere of such pure dread that people would cross the street to avoid it. Some witnesses described feeling a chilling sensation when they looked at it, as if they were being judged for their sins by something ancient and cruel. The man said this had been happening for decades. Police reports went back to the 1950s at least. Some officers claimed to have seen the figure themselves. Others dismissed it as mass hysteria, urban legend, folklore repeated so often it had taken on a life of its own. But the reports never stopped. Every few months, someone new would file a complaint. A frightening encounter, an inexplicable presence, a shadow in the shape of a man with a hood pulled low over its face. I laughed it off as ghost stories, the kind of creepy nonsense that accumulates around old cities. But deep down, something about the narrative unsettled me. I found myself Googling late into the night, reading forum posts from locals describing their encounters with the hooded figure. The descriptions were consistent across decades and independent accounts. Always the same details: the hood, the stillness, the overwhelming sense that whatever was watching you was not human, that it was something that had existed long before you were born and would continue to exist long after you died. October arrived, and the nights became longer. The darkness came earlier. I started walking home from the train station through Gastown instead of taking a direct route. Something about the neighborhood was becoming compulsive for me, like I was being drawn to it. I told myself I was just getting to know my new city, but there was something else happening. Something I did not want to examine too closely. I first saw the figure on October 18th. I was walking home late from work, around 11 at night. The streets were mostly empty. The shops had closed. The bars were still open, but I lived on a quieter block that attracted fewer people. As I turned onto the street where my apartment building stood, I noticed something moving in my peripheral vision. A shape, a tall, dark shape that seemed to be part of the shadows themselves. It wore a hood, pulled so low that I could not see any face, any features, anything to suggest it was a human being at all. My first instinct was to keep walking. This is what I tell myself now. My first instinct was to ignore it and continue on to my apartment. But I stopped. I actually stopped walking and turned to look directly at the figure. This was a mistake. This was the moment everything began to unravel. The hooded figure was standing completely motionless in the middle of the street. It was staring at me. I could not see eyes, could not see any facial features, but I felt its attention on me with a certainty that was absolutely chilling. The sensation was not like being watched by a person. It was like being observed by something vast and malevolent, something that existed outside the normal parameters of human experience. The creepy, disturbing weight of that attention made my knees weak. I stood frozen for several seconds. The temperature around the figure seemed to drop. My breath became visible in the air. And then the hooded figure tilted its head, a gesture so slow and deliberate that it looked like the movement of something learning how a human body moves. It tilted its head and raised one arm, pointing directly at me. Its finger extended from the darkness of its hood, and in that moment, I felt a terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a nightmare made manifest, the kind of fear that bypasses your rational mind and speaks directly to the primitive part of your brain that knows when death is near. I ran the last block to my apartment building and slammed the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my key into the lock for the interior door. Once I was inside my apartment, I locked every door, closed every blind, and sat in the middle of my living room with all the lights on, trembling like I had just escaped from something genuinely horrifying. I told myself it was just a homeless person wearing a hood, someone playing a prank. But I knew better. Deep down, in a place I did not want to examine, I knew that what I had seen was not a normal human being. There was something wrong with its proportions, its movements. The way it existed in space seemed to distort reality around it. That eerie, unsettling presence had not diminished once I got inside. If anything, it had intensified. I felt it outside my building, waiting, watching, interested in me now in a way that was absolute terror. I did not sleep that night. The next day, I forced myself to research the figure more extensively. I found police reports, actual official documents from the Vancouver Police Department, describing encounters with the hooded figure dating back to 1947. Witnesses reported the same details I had experienced. The hood, the stillness, the absolute certainty that what they were looking at was not human. Some witnesses reported that after seeing the figure, they experienced nightmares for weeks. Others reported health problems. One woman documented that she had become convinced the hooded figure was going to return to her apartment and that she had moved 3 times to try to escape it. But here's what disturbed me most. The police reports went silent for a 3-year period in the 1990s. No sightings, no reports. The department even noted in an official memo that the hooded figure seemed to have disappeared. Then, in 1993, the sightings resumed. A teenager reported seeing it near the old execution site. Then a businessman reported an encounter. Then multiple sightings within the same week. It was as if the figure had been dormant, resting, and then awakened. I realized with creeping, chilling dread that the last concentrated period of sightings had been exactly 10 years ago. October 1994. Multiple encounters reported in a single month. And now, exactly 1 decade later, the reports were beginning again. People online were posting about strange experiences in Gastown. A creepy figure in the shadows. An eerie presence that seemed to be building toward something. I was not alone. Others were seeing it again. October 25th. I saw it again, but this time I was prepared. Or I thought I was. I had started carrying my phone, ready to film any encounter as proof that I was not losing my mind. I was walking through Gastown during the early evening, and I saw the hooded figure standing in an alley. It was facing away from me, just standing there, motionless. I could see the noose around its neck. An actual noose, the rope dark and worn with age, hanging loosely around its neck. The bottom end of the rope disappeared into the darkness of its hood. I felt the terrifying, nightmare-inducing urge to film it, but I was also absolutely certain that if I pointed my phone at the figure, it would turn around. And I knew with a certainty that transcended logic that if I saw its face, if I saw what existed beneath that hood, something would break inside me. Something fundamental would shatter. I kept walking without filming, but I could feel it tracking me. The hooded figure did not move, did not turn around, but its attention followed me like a searchlight. By the time I reached the corner, I was running again. That night, I began experiencing the disturbing dreams. In the nightmare, I was standing in Gastown, but it was not the modern neighborhood. It was the 1880s. The gallows stood in the center of the street. Dozens of bodies hung from the beam, their bodies limp, their eyes open and staring. And standing among them, adjusting the position of a body, checking the tightness of a noose, was the hooded figure. It moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times, who had executed 10,000 people, who would execute 10,000 more. The nightmare was so vivid, So horrifying that I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. And as I sat in bed, trying to calm myself, I heard something that turned my blood to ice. Knocking. Slow, deliberate knocking. Not on my apartment door. It came from the radiator, the water pipes, the walls themselves. A rhythm that sounded like a hanging rope creaking in the wind. October 29th. The sightings have escalated into something that the local news is finally starting to cover. 3 separate incidents reported in one day. A woman saw the figure outside a restaurant. A man encountered it at the train station. A group of teenagers documented seeing it near the old execution site. The police have increased patrols in the neighborhood. Officers have been instructed to approach any suspicious figures. But the hooded figure is not suspicious in the way police understand suspicious. It does not commit crimes. It does not assault people. It simply appears, observes, and disappears. There is nothing they can arrest, nothing they can investigate beyond the terror it creates simply by existing. The creepy, chilling realization that has consumed me is this. The hooded figure is choosing who to reveal itself to. It appeared to me first on October 18th. Since then, it has shown itself to 17 other people that I can verify through social media and local news reports. The number is growing exponentially. Every day, more people encounter it. Every day, more people experience the horrifying certainty that they are being observed by something that exists beyond normal human understanding. I have stopped going to work. I have stopped leaving my apartment. I sit in my living room with every light on, listening to the pipes knock out that terrible rhythm. And I know, with an eerie, unsettling certainty that chills me to my core, what is happening. The hooded figure is waking up, just like it did in 1994, just like it did in the 1950s. It awakens every decade, and it walks the streets of Gastown, reacquainting itself with the place where it once executed hundreds of people. Remembering the feel of the noose, the weight of the bodies, the justice it once administered. But this time is different. This time it is not just observing. This time it is choosing. I can feel it outside my building right now. I can hear it in the walls. I can sense its presence like a pressure that is slowly crushing me from all sides. And I know, with an absolute terror that words cannot capture, that it has chosen me and the 16 others. It has selected us for something. A purpose I do not want to understand. The nightmare is only beginning. If you are reading or listening to this in Vancouver, if you live in Gastown or visit the neighborhood, be warned. Watch for the hooded figure. If you see it, do not make eye contact. Do not film it. Do not acknowledge its existence in any way. Because once it knows you see it, once it begins to focus its horrifying attention on you, nothing in your life will ever be normal again. I do not know how this ends. I do not know what the figure wants from me and the others it has chosen. But I know that we are running out of time. The knocking in the walls is becoming louder. The darkness is pressing in closer. And somewhere in the eerie shadows of Gastown, the hooded executioner is preparing for something terrible. Something that will change everything. Story 4. Calgary Devil, this ridge creature. I have footage that I cannot explain. Video that contradicts everything I understand about wildlife, about nature, about what is possible in our world. This is my account of what happened on Devil S Ridge near Calgary, and why I have not set foot in the Canadian Rockies since that day. If you have ever felt that creepy sensation of being watched by something that does not belong, if you have ever experienced that chilling moment when you realize you are not alone in the wilderness, then you need to hear this. Because what we filmed that day is still out there, and it is still climbing. My name is not important anymore. What matters is the truth. I was part of a hiking group in late September. 4 of us who decided to explore Devil S Ridge, a remote section of the Canadian Rockies near Calgary. We were experienced hikers. We had proper equipment, maps, communication devices, and what we believed was enough knowledge to navigate the backcountry safely. We were idiots. We had no idea what was watching us from those cliffs. The hike began normally enough. The weather was clear, crisp autumn air, the kind that makes you feel alive and invincible. The trail wound through pine forests and across alpine meadows. Around mile 5, we reached the ridge itself, a dramatic series of cliff faces that rose maybe 800 feet from the valley floor. The rock formations were stunning, the kind of landscape that makes you understand why people are drawn to wild places despite the danger. We stopped for lunch at a viewpoint, and that is when Marcus, one of our group, noticed something disturbing on the cliff face across the valley. He pointed it out to the rest of us. At first, I thought it was a mountain goat. We had seen several during the hike, but something about this shape was wrong. Its proportions were off. The limbs were too long, too articulated, moving in a way that no goat or bighorn sheep could move. It was climbing the cliff headfirst, which immediately triggered an unsettling, eerie alarm in my brain. Mountain goats climb down cliffs headfirst sometimes, but this thing was climbing up, defying gravity in a way that was absolutely horrifying to watch. Its limbs moved with an unnatural fluidity, bending and extending in ways that seemed to have too many joints. The body was lean, impossibly elongated, the kind of frame that could not possibly exist in any known animal. We all fell silent, watching this terrifying creature scale the vertical rock face like it was moving across flat ground. Marcus started filming. He pulled out his phone and recorded the creature as it climbed higher and higher up the cliff. The video was shaky, the resolution not perfect, but it captured enough detail to make the nightmare crystal clear. The creature moved with a rhythm and purpose that suggested absolute familiarity with the landscape. This was not a one-time visitor to the area. This thing lived here. It hunted here. It knew every inch of that mountain. The most chilling detail was that at several points during the climb, the creature stopped and turned its head toward us. I cannot describe with accuracy what its face looked like because I could not make out facial features clearly from that distance. But the way it turned was wrong. The neck extended further than a neck should extend. The head tilted at an angle that should have snapped bone. And in that moment when it looked directly at us, we all felt it. That creepy, disturbing sensation of being observed by something that understood it was being watched. Something that was not afraid of us. The creature continued climbing until it reached the top of the cliff and disappeared over the ridge. We stood in silence for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Then the fear hit us. Real, visceral, terrifying fear. The kind that bypasses your rational mind and speaks directly to that ancient part of your brain that knows when a predator is near. We decided to leave immediately. The fun, carefree mood of the hike evaporated instantly. We packed up our things and started back down the trail toward the parking area. But here's where the nightmare took a turn toward something worse. We realized we were being followed. I could not see anything behind us on the trail, but I could hear it. The sound of something moving through the forest with an eerie, unsettling grace. Not the heavy, loud crashing of a bear or elk. This was something moving deliberately, carefully, as if it was stalking us with intelligence and purpose. We walked faster. The sounds behind us accelerated to match our pace. We were not outrunning it. It was herding us, controlling the distance between us, playing with us the way a cat plays with a mouse. The chilling realization hit me that we should not be walking down a narrow trail where this thing could ambush us from either side. We needed to get to an open area, to the parking lot, to civilization, to anywhere that was not this isolated stretch of wilderness. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The unsettling sensation of danger was overwhelming. A pure, primal terror that made every muscle in my body tense and ready to run. When we finally emerged from the forest into the parking area, the sounds behind us stopped. We did not look back. We got in the vehicles and drove away, and none of us spoke for the entire drive back to Calgary. The only sound was the wind and the rumble of the engine and our breathing, which was still rapid and panicked from the experience. Marcus uploaded the video to an outdoor enthusiast forum that night. He did not explain what the creature was, just posted the footage with a caption asking if anyone could identify the species. Within hours, the post had hundreds of comments. People were baffled. Zoologists, wildlife experts, outdoor enthusiasts, all trying to explain what was in the video. The consensus was that it could not be real. It was a hoax. It was a person in a suit. It was some kind of digital manipulation. But then we received a message from someone claiming to work for Alberta Wildlife Services. The message was urgent, almost panicked. It told us to take down the video immediately. The person said that they had received reports of a creature matching the description we had filmed, and that the Alberta government was investigating the incident. They said showing the footage publicly could cause panic and could potentially draw attention to something that needed to remain hidden for public safety reasons. This is when I knew something was genuinely horrifying, truly terrifying. This was not just an unknown animal. This was something that authorities were actively trying to conceal. Marcus refused to take the video down. He reposted it across multiple platforms, and it went viral. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people. Major news outlets picked up the story. Wildlife experts debated the footage on television. The creepy, eerie mystery of the Calgary Devil, S-Ridge creature became a genuine phenomenon, trending on social media, discussed in Reddit threads, analyzed frame by people with expertise in animal behavior and biology. And then the official response came. Alberta Wildlife Services issued a statement saying they had investigated the video and determined it was a hoax. A prank. A person in an elaborate costume designed to look like an unidentified creature. The statement was so obviously false, so transparently a cover-up, that it only added to the mystery. If it was just a hoax, why were they commenting on it at all? Why the urgency to have the video removed? I received a phone call 3 days after posting the video. The caller did not identify themselves, but the voice was calm and authoritative, the kind of voice that belongs to someone accustomed to being obeyed. The person told me that I had made a serious mistake by allowing the video to be shared publicly. They explained that there were things in the world that people were not meant to know about, things that existed in the wild places beyond civilization, things that were best left undisturbed and unknown. The caller said they understood that what we had filmed was unsettling, eerie, and difficult to explain. But they warned me that if we continued to discuss the incident publicly, if we continued to share the footage, there would be consequences. Not threats exactly, but a chilling implication that there were powerful forces interested in keeping this secret contained. I have not hiked since that day. I have not returned to the Canadian Rockies, and I have developed a terrible habit of checking my windows at night, making sure that nothing is watching me from the darkness beyond my apartment. The unsettling sensation of being observed has not left me. It has become a constant background hum in my mind, a creepy awareness that something knows who I am, knows where I live, and is waiting for something. The most disturbing discovery came 6 weeks after the incident. I was researching missing persons cases in the Calgary area, looking for connections to the creature sighting. I found something horrifying. Over the past 15 years, there have been 18 missing hikers in the Devil's Ridge area. 18 people who had gone into the mountains and never returned. 18 investigations that had gone nowhere. 18 cold cases that remained unsolved. The dates were not random. The disappearances seemed to follow a pattern, 1 or 2 every year or so, but then occasional years with clustering. Multiple disappearances within weeks of each other. And when I cross-referenced the dates with my own research, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In 3 of those years, there had been reported sightings of unusual creatures in the area. Animals that could not be identified. Creatures that moved in ways that did not match any known species. The nightmare possibility that I cannot escape is this. The creature we filmed was not an isolated incident. It is not a one-off aberration of nature. It is something that has been in those mountains for a very long time. Something that has been taking hikers, eliminating witnesses, leaving no trace beyond the missing persons reports that authorities quietly file away and forget about. I have tried to move on with my life. I have tried to pretend that day never happened, that we never filmed that terrifying creature climbing the cliff headfirst. That I never received that phone call warning me about the consequences of speaking publicly about what we saw. But the fear has not diminished. The unsettling, chilling certainty that something is watching me, waiting for me, has only grown stronger. Last week, I saw something in the news. A hiking group in the Devil's Ridge area had filmed another video. Another creature, different location, but same characteristics. The same long limbs, the same unnatural movements, the same eerie, disturbing way it moved across terrain that should have been impossible to traverse. The video is being shared now, going viral again, and I know what is going to happen. The authorities will deny it. They will cover it up. They will try to suppress the truth. But the truth is this. Something is living in those mountains. Something that is not human, not any known animal. Something that operates outside the boundaries of our understanding of nature. Something that has learned to hunt us. Something that is patient and intelligent and absolutely terrifying. And somewhere in the darkness of those Canadian peaks, it is still climbing. Still hunting. Still waiting for the next hiker to step into its territory. The danger is real. The horror is real. And I fear that one day, that creature will come down from the mountains and into our cities, and no one will be able to stop it. If you go hiking in the Canadian Rockies, if you venture into remote wilderness near Calgary, watch the cliffs. Watch for movement that is too fluid, too articulated, too wrong. Because if you see what I saw, if you encounter that terrifying creature face to face, you will understand the true meaning of fear. You will experience that chilling, nightmarish moment when you realize that the wilderness is not your home, that you are the intruder, and that something far older and far more dangerous is watching your every move. Story 5. Grasping crew of the SS Kamloops. The corpse followed me through the darkness. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I have replayed those moments 1,000 times, trying to convince myself it was the current, the angle of my flashlight, nitrogen narcosis playing tricks on my oxygen-starved brain. But I know what I saw. The body moved with purpose, tracking me through the flooded corridors of the SS Kamloops like it had been waiting decades for someone to come back. Lake Superior does not give up its dead. The water is too cold, too deep, too unforgiving. Bodies do not decompose down there. They do not bloat and float to the surface like they would in warmer waters. They stay preserved, suspended in the darkness, trapped forever in the moment of their death. The lake has claimed hundreds of ships and thousands of souls. The SS Kamloops is just one of them. But what happened to me down there, what I experienced in that frozen tomb, that was something different. Something terrifying beyond any nightmare I could have imagined. The Kamloops went down in December 1927, caught in a vicious winter storm near Isle Royale. She was a package freighter, carrying supplies and crew across the Great Lakes. When the blizzard hit, the ship vanished without a trace. No distress calls, no survivors. Just gone, swallowed by Superior's cruel depths. They searched for months but found nothing. The families of the 22 crew members buried empty coffins and tried to move on with their lives. 50 years later, a team of divers finally located the wreck. 260 feet down, resting on a rocky ledge, the Kamloops sat remarkably intact. And inside, they found the crew. Still there, still wearing their work clothes, perfectly preserved by the near-freezing water, their bodies suspended in the flooded compartments like exhibits in some horrifying underwater museum. I am a commercial diver, 20 years of experience. Oil rigs, salvage operations, underwater construction. I have seen things that would give most people nightmares. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what awaited inside that ship. My team was contracted to document the wreck, take measurements, assess the structural integrity for a historical preservation project. Standard work. Easy money, or so I thought. We descended through layers of increasingly dark water, the sunlight fading with every meter. By the time we reached the Kamloops, we were operating entirely by flashlight. The ship loomed out of the darkness like a metal ghost, encrusted with decades of lake-bottom sediment. The cold seeped through my dry suit immediately. Superior's water hovers just above freezing, even in summer. My breath came in controlled bursts, each exhalation creating a stream of bubbles that rose toward a surface I could no longer see. The entry point was a cargo hatch that had been forced open by earlier diving teams. I squeezed through, my tank scraping against the corroded metal. Inside, the beam of my flashlight revealed a scene frozen in time. Rusted equipment, scattered supplies, and in the corner of the cargo hold, partially obscured by a fallen support beam, I saw him for the first time. The divers call him Grandpa, one of the Kamloops crew, still down there, still at his post after nearly a century. His body floated upright in the water, held in place by the current and the confined space. His face was pale, almost white, his features preserved in eerie detail by the cold. His work clothes hung on his frame, moving slightly with the water, this movement. His eyes were open. That detail hit me like a punch. His eyes were open, and they seemed to be staring directly at me. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling. Dead bodies do not bother me. I have recovered drowning victims, worked accident scenes, dealt with human remains in various states. But something about Grandpa was different. The way he hung there, perfectly still except for the gentle sway of the current. The way the shadows played across his preserved face. The creeping sensation that I was being watched by something that should not be able to watch. I moved deeper into the ship, documenting each section as planned. The engine room, the crew quarters, the galley where men had eaten their last meal before the storm claimed them. Every compartment told a story of sudden disaster. Cups still sat on tables, coats hung on hooks, playing cards lay scattered across a bunk. These men had not expected to die that night. Death had come for them fast and cold and merciless. That is when I found Whitey, the second preserved body, deeper in the ship, floating in a narrow corridor that connected the crew quarters to the cargo area. He earned his nickname from the pale, bleached appearance of his skin after so many years in the water. Unlike Grandpa, who remained in one place, Whitey was known to move. Divers who had visited the wreck before reported finding him in different locations. The current, they said. Just the current pushing the body around the interior spaces. But the current does not explain what happened next. I was photographing a section of corridor when my light caught movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, expecting to see my dive partner. Instead, I saw Whitey. He had been behind me, at least 30 feet back when I had passed him. Now he was closer, much closer, maybe 10 feet away, floating in the middle of the corridor, his body oriented toward me, his arms drifting outward as if reaching. My heart rate spiked, consuming oxygen faster than it should. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think rationally. The current had pushed him. That was all. Just the current. I turned back to my work, trying to focus on the camera, the measurements, anything but the corpse floating behind me. But I could feel it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The primitive part of my brain screaming that something was wrong, that I was in danger, that I needed to leave this place immediately. I moved further down the corridor, putting distance between myself and Whitey. The ship groaned around me, metal stress and water pressure creating sounds that echoed through the flooded spaces. My light swept across doorways, revealing glimpses of other compartments, other spaces where death had come calling. And in one doorway, I saw another body, a third crew member that was not supposed to be there. Not documented, not recorded in any of the dive reports I had studied. This one was smaller than the others, younger perhaps. His uniform suggested he had been a deckhand. He floated horizontally, his face turned toward the corridor, toward me. And just like Grandpa, his eyes were open. But there was something different about this one. Something in the way the shadows fell across his features. Something that looked almost like recognition. I checked my dive computer. 20 minutes down, plenty of air. But the anxiety was eating through my oxygen faster than it should. I decided to head back, to exit the wreck and surface. I had enough documentation for the day. More than enough. I turned to retrace my path through the corridor. Whitey blocked my way. He had moved again. Impossibly, silently. Now he floated directly in the path I needed to take to reach the exit. His arms were still extended, fingers splayed, as if waiting to grab anyone who tried to pass. The water around him seemed darker somehow, colder, as if his presence absorbed light and warmth. I told myself it was the current. It had to be the current. But there was no current strong enough to move a body that far that fast in this confined space. And the position, the reaching arms, the way his body was oriented directly toward me, that could not be random. That could not be coincidence. I switched off my light. Total darkness engulfed me. A risky move at that depth. In a wreck. But I needed to see if the body was reacting to my flashlight somehow, tracking the beam. I counted to 10 in the pitch black, my breath loud in my ears, my imagination running wild with thoughts of what might be moving toward me through the darkness. When I turned the light back on, Whitey had moved. He was now less than 5 feet away. Close enough that I could see the individual threads of his rotted uniform. Close enough to see the pale, wrinkled texture of his preserved skin. Close enough to see that his mouth had opened, as if he was trying to speak, to warn me, or perhaps to scream. I panicked. Pure survival instinct kicked in. I pushed off the corridor wall and swam directly at him, deciding to go through rather than around. As I passed, his arm brushed against my tank. Not the current moving him. His arm moved, reached, tried to grab. I felt the impact, felt the resistance, felt something that should have been as pliable as frozen meat catch at my equipment with far too much strength. I did not look back. I swam faster than I should have at that depth, risking decompression sickness, risking equipment failure, risking everything. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I stopped, if I slowed down, those corpses would catch me. They would pull me deeper into the ship, into the darkness, and I would never leave. I would become part of the Kamloops, another preserved crew member floating in the frozen corridors, waiting for the next diver to visit, reaching out with dead hands to pull them down into that terrible fellowship. I burst through the cargo hatch and out into open water. The wreck fell away beneath me as I began my ascent. But even as I rose toward safety, toward light and warmth and life, I could not shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me go, waiting for me to return. My dive partner had exited before me, waiting at a decompression stop. When I reached him, I tried to explain what had happened, through hand signals and later, back on the surface, with words. But how do you explain that the dead moved? How do you convince anyone that corpses nearly a century old reached for you with purpose and intent? The dive team reviewed my footage. The cameras had captured Whitey in different positions, confirming he had moved. But they dismissed it as current, as we had all been taught to do. They showed me flow patterns, explained how water moves through wrecked ships, demonstrated how a body could drift from one location to another. But they could not explain the speed. They could not explain how a corpse floating in one direction suddenly appeared 30 feet away without passing through the intervening space. I never went back to the Kamloops. I turned down every contract, every request, every amount of money offered. Other divers still visit the wreck. They still document Grandpa, still find Whitey in new locations, still report that unsettling feeling of being watched by the preserved dead. Some laugh it off. Some never return. A few, like me, refuse to talk about what they experienced down there in detail, as if speaking the words might somehow call that attention back. Lake Superior keeps its dead, and the dead of the SS Kamloops are still there, still waiting, still reaching out from their watery grave. They've been down there for almost 100 years. They will be there for 100 more, preserved, watching, following anyone brave or foolish enough to enter their domain. So here's my question for you. If you had the chance to dive the Kamloops, to see with your own eyes these perfectly preserved crew members frozen in time, would you take it? Would you descend into that cold darkness, knowing what might be waiting in those flooded corridors? Or would you trust your instincts, listen to that primitive fear that tells you some places should remain undisturbed? Write your answer in the comments, because somewhere deep in Lake Superior, in the frozen hold of a ship that went down nearly a century ago, something is still moving through the darkness. And it is still reaching. Story 6, Dungarvon Whooper, a curse that still haunts. I heard the whooping sound at 2 in the morning, and I knew immediately that I was going to die in these woods. That sound I ascend to something that belongs to any animal I've ever heard before. It's not a coyote or a loon or any natural creature that lives in the Canadian wilderness. It is something else entirely. Something terrifying and eerie and deeply, profoundly wrong. I am sitting here in a ranger station in New Brunswick, Canada, and I need to tell you what happened to me in the Dungarvon Valley before I lose my nerve. Before I convince myself that it was all some kind of nightmare. My name is Michael, and I am a wildlife biologist. I was hired to do a 3-month study of the animal populations in the Dungarvon Valley in New Brunswick. It was supposed to be routine work, track wildlife migration patterns, document sightings, collect data that would help the provincial government manage the forest resources. I've done this work in a dozen different locations across Canada and the northern United States. I know how to live in the wilderness. I know how to handle isolation. I thought I was prepared for anything the forest could throw at me. I wasn't prepared for the Dungarvon Whooper. The valley itself is beautiful. Ancient forest, pristine wilderness, the kind of landscape that makes you feel small and insignificant in the best possible way. The Dungarvon River runs through it, cold and clear, perfect for trout fishing. There are hiking trails and old logging roads and signs of human activity from generations past. It is a place that feels untouched by modern civilization, which is exactly why I wanted to study it. What I didn't know when I arrived is that the valley has a history. A dark, disturbing history that the locals try not to talk about. In the winter of 1888, there was a lumber camp deep in the Dungarvon Valley. The camp was run by a foreman named Anderson, and the cook was a man named Fred McLeod. According to the old stories, Fred was well liked by the workers. He was a good cook, which was important because logging camps depended on their cooks to keep the men fed and happy. Fred had accumulated a significant amount of gold during his time working in the forest. Gold that he had saved, hidden away, kept secret from most people. But not everyone was unaware of Fred's wealth. Anderson, the camp foreman, knew about the gold, and Anderson wanted it. One winter night, after all the workers had gone to bed, Anderson murdered Fred McLeod inside that lumber camp. He killed the cook who had fed him, who had provided warmth and comfort and sustenance. Anderson murdered Fred for his gold, and he left the body in the camp to be discovered by the horrifying scene of a man killed for greed and desire and human cruelty. Except something happened after Fred died, something that the locals attributed to either supernatural revenge or a spiritual transformation. Something that turned Fred McLeod's death into a legend that persists to this day. Starting that very night, a sound began echoing through the Dungarvon Valley. A terrifying whooping scream, a blood-curdling wail that didn't sound human and didn't sound animal. A noise that haunted the forest so completely that people stopped coming to that part of the wilderness. Loggers refused to work there. Hunters avoided the area. Trappers steered clear. The sound, that eerie whooping call, became known as the Dungarvon Whooper. For more than 100 years, people have reported hearing the Dungarvon Whooper. The sound has been documented in local records, written about in newspapers, discussed in academic studies about folklore and legend. Some people believe it is the ghost of Fred McLeod, still seeking revenge on the man who murdered him. Other people believe it is something darker, something that Fred McLeod became after his death. A Wendigo, perhaps, or some other malevolent spirit that feeds on rage and blood and a hunger for vengeance. The creepy thing is that the Dungarvon Whooper is still being reported. Within the last 20 years, hikers and campers and outdoor enthusiasts have all reported hearing that terrifying sound in the valley. The whooping scream hasn't stopped. It hasn't faded into legend. It is still there, still active, still hunting. I read all of this information before I arrived at the Dungarvon Valley. I told myself that it was folklore, that it was an urban legend, a story that locals told to scare tourists and maintain the mystique of the wilderness. That there was a rational explanation for every reported sighting and every supposed sound. I was a scientist. I believed in evidence and data and things that could be measured and documented. I should have believed the stories. I set up my research camp about 15 miles up into the valley, away from civilization, away from roads, in the heart of the old logging territory. I had a tent, a portable lab, weather equipment, motion sensing cameras, sound recording devices. Everything I needed to document animal activity. The location I chose was actually near where the old lumber camp had stood. Historians had marked it on maps, noted its location, and I thought it would be interesting to study wildlife patterns in that particular area. The first week was uneventful. I recorded various animals, deer, bears, smaller mammals. I documented migration patterns. I collected data. I followed my research protocol. It was boring, predictable work, the kind of thing I had done dozens of times before in dozens of different locations. And then I heard the sound. It came around midnight on the 8th night. I was in my tent, asleep, when I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. It was a whooping scream, distant but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. The sound was like nothing I had ever heard before. It wasn't aggressive or attacking. It was almost mournful. It was a cry of profound anguish mixed with something darker, something hungry and dangerous and deeply unsettling. I turned on my portable lights and checked my sound recording equipment. I had captured the sound. I could see the audio waves displayed on my laptop screen. The frequencies were strange. They didn't match any known animal. They didn't match the vocalizations of any creature in the North American wilderness. I told myself that I would investigate during daylight, that I would follow the sound to its source, that I would find a rational explanation. But the truth is, I was terrified. I was scared in a way that science couldn't explain away. There was something in that sound that bypassed my logical brain and spoke directly to the primitive part of my mind that understands danger and fear in the presence of something that wants to hurt you. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I reviewed my audio files and prepared to track the source of the sound. I loaded my backpack with supplies, grabbed my camera, and set out into the forest following the approximate direction where the sound had originated. The trail took me deeper into the valley, away from my camp, into territory that felt increasingly isolated and eerie. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found something that made me stop cold. There were old structures, remnants of buildings, rotting wooden beams and weathered logs and foundations that had survived for more than a century. The old lumber camp, I had found it. The camp was a nightmare landscape. Everything was decaying, decomposing, returning to the forest. But scattered among the ruins were items that suggested human habitation. Old tools, fragments of clothing, a metal stove, rusted but still recognizable. And in the center of what had once been the main building, I found something that made my blood go cold. There was a grave marker, a simple wooden cross, weathered by decades of exposure to the elements. And carved into the wood, barely legible but still visible, were 2 names and 2 dates. One name was Fred McLeod. The other name was Anderson. They had died within days of each other in the winter of 1888. Someone had buried them together. Someone had marked their graves. Someone had acknowledged their deaths in this remote and frightening location. I photographed the grave marker and the site, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely hold the camera steady. And as I was photographing, I heard it, that whooping sound again, but this time it was closer, much closer, close enough that I could hear the anguish and rage in it. Close enough that I could feel the presence of something in the forest watching me. I ran. I don't remember the exact road I took back to my camp, but I ran as fast as I could, and I didn't stop until I was back at my tent with the zipper sealed. My heart was pounding. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. I was terrified in a way that I had never experienced before. That night, I packed up most of my equipment. I decided that I was going to leave the Dungarvon Valley. I decided that I couldn't continue this research project. Something was in these woods that science couldn't explain. Something that was intelligent and aware and actively watching me. But I couldn't leave immediately. It was late afternoon, already getting dark. The forest at night is dangerous for hiking. I would wait until morning, and then I would hike out to civilization as fast as I could. I was so careful that night. I locked myself in my tent. I kept all my lights on. I stayed awake, listening to every sound in the forest. And around midnight, the whooping started again. This time it was different. This time it sounded like it was right at the edge of my camp. Right outside my tent, close enough that I could hear the raw emotion in it. The rage, the hunger, the terrifying intelligence behind the sound. The whooper was calling to me. It was trying to communicate something. It was screaming its story across the darkness. I realized with a horrifying certainty that the Dungarvon Whooper wasn't just making random sounds. It was deliberately hunting me. It had been watching my movements in the valley. It knew I had found the grave. It knew I had discovered the connection between Fred McLeod and Anderson and the terrible history of this place. And it didn't want me to leave with that knowledge. The whooping continued for hours. It would move around my camp, circling it, staying just outside the reach of my flashlight beams. Sometimes it sounded far away. Sometimes it sounded close enough that I could see shadows moving through the darkness. Sometimes it sounded almost like a human voice, like someone was trying to speak but could only produce that terrifying wail. Just before dawn, the sound stopped. The forest went silent. The whooper, whatever it was, retreated back into the depths of the wilderness. I didn't wait for sunrise. I packed my equipment as quickly as I could in the darkness and began hiking toward the nearest trail that would lead me out of the valley. I moved as fast as my legs could carry me, my backpack heavy, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to get away from this place. But here is the terrifying part. Here is where everything becomes even more horrifying. After hiking for what felt like hours, I realized that I wasn't making progress toward the edge of the valley. I was still in the same section of forest. The landmarks I was passing looked familiar. I was going in circles. The forest itself seemed to be keeping me inside the Dungarvon Valley. I stopped and tried to use my GPS device to determine my location. The device wasn't working. The compass I had wasn't pointing correctly. The normal tools for navigation that should have worked perfectly weren't functioning properly. It was like the valley itself was rejecting my attempts to escape. And then I heard the whooping sound again. But this time it wasn't distant. It was close, terrifyingly close, close enough that I could hear the breathing behind it, close enough that I could sense the presence of something large and intelligent moving through the forest. I realized something in that moment, something deeply disturbing and unsettling. The Dungarvon Whooper wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trying to keep me here. It was trying to trap me in this valley with it and with the grave of Fred McLeod and Anderson. It was trying to add me to the list of people who belong to this place. I don't know how I escaped. I don't have a clear memory of the actual escape. I remember running. I remember the sound chasing me. I remember the feeling of the forest pressing in on all sides, trying to hold me, trying to keep me trapped in that eerie and haunted landscape. And then, suddenly, I was out. I burst through a tree line and found myself on an old logging road. I ran down that road for miles until I reached a ranger station. When I arrived at the ranger station, I was in shock. I was dehydrated, exhausted, covered in scratches and dirt. The rangers questioned me about what happened. I told them about hearing the whooping sound. I told them about finding the grave. I told them about my belief that the forest itself was trying to keep me trapped. They nodded sympathetically and told me that I had experienced what they called valley madness. They said that the isolation combined with the fear and the legends about the Dungarvon Whooper had caused me to have a psychological break. That I had gotten lost and disoriented in the forest, and my mind had created a narrative of horror to explain my confusion. They insisted that I get medical evaluation. They sent me to a hospital where I was evaluated by psychiatrists who suggested that I had experienced acute stress disorder combined with anxiety-induced hallucinations. They prescribed medication. They suggested therapy. They tried very hard to convince me that nothing supernatural had happened to me. But I know what I heard. I know what I experienced. And most disturbing of all, I know what I discovered when I reviewed my audio recording equipment after returning to civilization. My recording devices captured the whooping sound. Multiple instances of it. The audio files are clear and distinct. I've played them for several audio engineers and wildlife acousticians. None of them can identify what animal or creature is making that sound. The frequencies, the tone, the structure of the call, none of it matches anything in the known animal kingdom. And there is something else, something that makes my blood run cold every time I think about it. When I review the audio from the night I tried to escape, there is a moment where the whooping sound gets very close to my tent. Very close. And in the background, underneath the whooping, you can hear something else. You can hear a voice, a human voice, speaking words that sound like a confession. The voice is saying things like, "They took it. They took my gold. I tried to protect them, but I couldn't. The gold brought the darkness. The gold brought him. And now I can. Stop. Now I can. Rest. Now I hunt so no one else comes here looking for what they came here looking for." They had the audio analyzed by professionals. They say the voice is probably a product of audio pareidolia, where the human brain finds patterns in random noise and interprets them as meaningful information. They say I'm probably hearing what I expect to hear based on the legends about Fred McLeod and the curse of the Dungarvon Whooper. But I know what I heard. I know that the voice was real. And I know that Fred McLeod, or whatever Fred McLeod became after his murder, was trying to warn me. Trying to explain something to me. Trying to communicate across the barrier between life and death. They applied to go back. The authorities have denied my request. They told me I'm not permitted to return to the Dungarvon Valley without a psychiatric clearance. But I need to go back. I need to understand what happened to me in that forest. I need to confront the Dungarvon Whooper and either find peace with it or find my own answers about what happens in that terrifying and eerie place. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whooping sound. Even though I am hundreds of miles away from the Dungarvon Valley, even though I am living in a city surrounded by people and civilization and normal human activity, I still hear it. The blood-curdling wail, the cry of rage and anguish and something that might be hunger or might be loneliness or might be something I've done to have words to describe. And I am starting to think that the whooper doesn't want me to stay away. I am starting to think that being close to the sound, even from a distance, means that I am still connected to that valley. Still trapped somehow in its eerie embrace. Still part of its dark history. The creepy truth is that I think I was never supposed to leave. I think part of me is still there, in the Dungarvon Valley, near that grave marker with two names carved into old, weathered wood. Part of me is still listening to the whooping sound in the darkness. Part of me is still trapped in that forest where the daylight never quite reaches and the shadows move with intelligence and intention. So here is my question for you, listener. If you heard something impossible, something that challenged everything you believed about reality, would you investigate further, even knowing that understanding might destroy your mind? Or would you turn away and try to convince yourself that it was never real? Write your answer in the comments. I want to know what you would do if you encountered the Dungarvon Whooper. Story 7. Black Dog of Miramichi. A terrifying confession. I disappeared for 43 days. Nobody knows where I went. I know. And I'm still not sure I escaped. My name is David Hartley. Until 3 months ago, I was a normal guy living a normal life in Portland, Maine. I worked in insurance, drove the same route to the office every day, and spent my weekends hiking or working on my house. I wasn't looking for scary stories or creepy encounters. I was just trying to live, but the scariest things in life, Don, to ask for permission. They find you when you least expect them. It started on a Tuesday in October. I was driving north on Highway 8, heading to a property inspection in the remote wilderness of New Brunswick, Canada. The job paid well, which was the only reason I agreed to make the drive. The road from Maine into New Brunswick is beautiful but isolating. Dense forests press against the asphalt on both sides. Towns are few and far between. Cell service becomes a luxury. By the time I crossed the border into Canada and headed deeper into the Miramichi region, I felt like I'd entered another world entirely. The sun was setting when I first saw it. I was about 2 hours into the Canadian wilderness, driving through a stretch of highway where the trees seemed to swallow the road behind me. The forest was thick with the deep greens and browns of late autumn, and the shadows between the trees were growing darker and more unsettling by the minute. My headlights cut through the gathering dusk, and I was thinking about finding a motel when I noticed something standing on the shoulder of the road about a quarter-mile ahead. At first, I thought it was a moose. They are common in that region, and drivers are warned about them constantly. But as I got closer, I realized this was something different. Something wrong. It was a dog, but not a normal dog. The creature was enormous, easily the size of a full-grown man on all fours. Its fur was black, not a normal dog black, but a terrifying, absolute darkness that seemed to absorb the light from my headlights rather than reflect it. The animal was standing perfectly still in the middle of the shoulder, facing directly toward my car. As I drew closer, my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. My breathing became shallow. Some ancient part of my brain was screaming at me that something was very wrong. Then I saw its eyes. They glowed, not reflected light like an animal, as eyes do when you shine headlights on them. No, these eyes emitted their own light, a sickly green phosphorescence that made my stomach turn. The eyes were intelligent, conscious, aware of me in a way that felt intensely personal and deeply disturbing. I was doing 70 miles an hour, but I started to slow down without thinking about it. My foot eased off the accelerator, and the car began to coast. I couldn't look away from the creature. The creepy, eerie sensation that washed over me was so powerful that I felt paralyzed. This was fear at a primal level, not fear of being attacked, but fear of something I didn't understand. Fear of the unknown. The dog turned its head and watched my car pass. I sped up then, my heart hammering against my ribs. In my rearview mirror, I could see the black dog watching me, its glowing eyes tracking my vehicle as it disappeared down the highway. I drove for another 15 minutes before I spotted a small motel called the Miramichi Rest. The parking lot was nearly empty. I pulled in and sat in my car for several minutes, hands still shaking, trying to tell myself that I'd seen a bear or some kind of wild animal that my frightened brain had misidentified. But I knew what I'd seen. That wasn't a bear. That wasn't any animal I could explain away with rational thought. Inside the motel, an older woman with tired eyes checked me in without much conversation. The room was small and sparse, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and pine salt. I locked the door, checked it twice, and then checked the windows. I turned on every light in the room and sat on the bed, staring at nothing. I told myself it was a one-time sighting. Stress from the drive, shadows and imagination. People dawn to encounter haunted, eerie creatures that defy explanation. Those are stories, urban legends. Not real, but something deep inside me knew better. Something in my bones understood that I encountered something that existed outside the normal world. Something that shouldn't exist. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, still on edge, I decided to push forward with my inspection. The property I needed to survey was about 40 minutes northeast of the motel, deep in the forest away from any main roads. The local broker had given me detailed directions, warning me to stay on the marked roads because people got lost in those woods sometimes. They never came back. He said it casually, like it was common knowledge, not a chilling prophecy. The gravel road to the property wound through increasingly dense forest. There were no other vehicles, no houses, no signs of civilization. Just trees and shadows and the sound of my tires crunching on loose stone. The day was overcast and gray, and the darkness under the trees made the afternoon feel like twilight. My radio had stopped picking up stations miles ago, and my cell phone showed no signal bars. I was completely alone. I found the property, an old abandoned vacation cabin that hadn't been maintained in years. The inspection was routine. I took photos, made notes, tried to focus on work and not on the way the forest seemed to lean in around the building. But my mind kept drifting back to the black dog, its size, its intelligence, those terrifying, glowing eyes. I was about halfway through my inspection when I noticed the scratches on the back wall of the cabin. At first, I thought they were just old marks from wildlife, but as I looked closer, I realized they were too deliberate, too organized. Deep gouges ran vertically down the wooden wall in groups of 5, repeated over and over, as if something with massive claws had repeatedly slashed the wood. Some of the scratches were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and slightly wet. The scratching was so recent it was still weeping. My mouth went dry. I stepped back from the wall and turned to leave the cabin. That when I heard the sound. It started as a low rumble somewhere in the distance, the kind of sound that you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. A growl, an animal, this growl, but deeper and more resonant than any animal growl I'd ever heard. The sound made the hair on my arms stand straight up. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get to my car and drive away as fast as I could. I didn't run. Instead, I walked quickly back through the cabin and outside to my car. The growl continued, distant but present, like thunder that never quite arrives. I got in my vehicle, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The drive back down the gravel road seemed to take forever. The trees on both sides pressed closer, and the shadows grew darker and more threatening with every passing mile. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the black dog emerge from the forest, those terrible glowing eyes fixing on me as it gave chase. But nothing followed me out of the woods that day. I drove directly back to the motel, my mind reeling. This wasn't a normal animal. Normal animals didn't scratch walls in that pattern. Normal animals didn't produce growls that sounded like they were generated from another dimension. Normal animals didn't have glowing eyes that burned with intelligence and malice. Back in my motel room, I did something I should have done earlier. I opened my laptop and searched for Black Dog Miramichi and Supernatural Creature New Brunswick. What I found made my blood run cold. There were dozens of posts on obscure folklore websites and Reddit threads dedicated to something locals called the Black Dog of the Miramichi. It was described in exactly the way I'd seen it. Enormous, black as pitch, glowing green or yellow eyes. The posts talked about sightings dating back more than 100 years. Some people said the creature was an omen of death, that seeing it meant something terrible was going to happen to you or someone you loved. Other posts were more disturbing. There were missing persons reports, hikers who went into the forest around Miramichi and never came back. A family in 1983 who lived near the region and disappeared without a trace. A college student from the University of New Brunswick who went hiking near the Miramichi River in 2007 and was found 5 days later, barely alive, suffering from severe dehydration and scratches all over her body. She refused to talk about what happened to her. She wouldn't explain the scratches. She just sat in a hospital bed, staring at nothing, occasionally whispering the word, running, over and over again. The most recent sighting had been only 6 months ago. A truck driver reported seeing a massive black dog on Highway 8 near the exact spot where I'd seen it. He described the same glowing eyes, the same overwhelming sense of dread. He said he felt compelled to stop his truck, and only by force of will did he manage to keep driving. He never reported it to police officially. He just posted about it on a paranormal forum and disappeared from the internet after that. No one knew what happened to him. My hands were trembling as I read these accounts. My rational mind tried to dismiss them as folklore and internet fiction, but after what I experienced, I couldn't. The possibility that what I encountered was real, that it was something known to leave people missing or traumatized, was absolutely terrifying. I made a decision that night. I would cancel the rest of my inspections in the region. I would drive back to Maine the next morning and get out of this nightmare landscape. I would go back to my normal life and try to forget what I'd seen. But the black dog had other plans. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of scratching outside my motel room window. It wasn't the soft scratching of a branch or tree limb hitting the glass. It was the same deliberate, organized scratching I heard at the abandoned cabin. Deep, forceful gouges, a rhythm of 5 scratches, then a pause, then 5 more. My heart nearly stopped. I lay in bed, frozen, listening to that horrible sound. The scratches continued for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then it stopped. I waited in absolute silence, barely breathing, my eyes staring at the window. I was terrified to move, terrified that any sound or motion would trigger another attack. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed and approached the window slowly. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to look out. There were deep gouges in the wooden frame around the window. Fresh gouges, and standing in the parking lot, silhouetted against the distant highway lights, was the black dog. It was impossibly tall, even from a distance. Its form seemed to defy natural proportions, stretched and twisted in ways that made my eyes hurt to look at. Those green eyes burned with a cold, patient intelligence. The creature wasn't snarling or attacking. It was simply watching, waiting. I dropped the curtain and stepped back from the window, My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. The dog was hunting me. It had followed me from the highway to the cabin to the motel. And now it was toying with me, letting me see it, letting me understand that I was not safe. That nowhere was safe. I grabbed my keys and my wallet and left the room without packing anything. I got in my car in the dark, locked the doors, and pulled out of the parking lot. In my headlights, I caught one last glimpse of the black dog, its massive form disappearing back into the shadows of the forest. I drove south on Highway 8 at speeds that were completely unsafe. My only thought was getting away from that creature, leaving the Miramichi region behind, and crossing back into Maine where things made sense, where creatures with glowing eyes didn't hunt people in the night. But as I drove through the darkness, I began to notice something eerie and unsettling happening. The highway behind me was completely empty. No cars, no trucks, no headlights, just empty asphalt stretching back into the darkness. And on the sides of the road, illuminated by my headlights for just a brief moment before disappearing into shadow, I could see movement. Dark shapes running through the trees on both sides of the highway, keeping pace with my car. At first, there was just one shape on the left. Then another appeared on the right. Then two more. By the time I'd been driving for 10 minutes, there were at least 8 or 9 of them running alongside my vehicle, all moving at the same speed I was driving, all keeping pace with perfect precision. I pushed the accelerator down harder. The speedometer climbed to 90 miles an hour, then 100. The shapes in the forest accelerated to match my speed. They were running effortlessly, gliding through the darkness like shadows given form and purpose. The road seemed to stretch out forever. I kept expecting to see a town, a gas station, anything that meant civilization and safety. But the forest continued, dark and seemingly endless. Highway 8 twisted and turned, and with each curve, I was certain I was going to see the black dog emerge from the trees directly in front of my car. It never did, but the creatures running alongside me never stopped either. This continued for what felt like several hours, but was probably only about 40 minutes. My gas tank was getting dangerously low, and I knew that if I ran out of fuel out here, in this darkness, with these things hunting me, I was finished. There would be no rescue. No one would ever find my car. Then I saw it, a gas station, a small, isolated pumps and a building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. No other cars, completely deserted, but it meant I could get gas. It meant there was a building where I might be able to hide or call for help. I pulled in and stopped at the pump. The shapes that had been running through the forest disappeared. The highway behind me was empty. The silence was absolute and deeply disturbing. I sat in my car for several minutes, watching the building, trying to decide if this was a trap or a genuine opportunity. Then the lights came on inside the gas station. One by one, the lights flickered to life in the windows and through the glass door. An old man appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the yellow light. He was waving at me, gesturing for me to come inside. Something about this felt wrong. The timing was too convenient. The isolated gas station suddenly coming to life right when I needed it. But I needed to move. I couldn't stay in the car. Whatever was hunting me was still out there. I got out, locked my car, and walked toward the gas station. The old man continued to wave, a strange smile on his face that I could see more clearly as I got closer. His teeth were wrong somehow. Too long, too yellow. The way he was smiling didn't match the expression in his eyes. When I got to the door, he stepped aside, still grinning, and gestured for me to enter. The interior of the gas station was impossibly large. The building was barely bigger than a closet from the outside, but inside, it seemed to extend back into shadows that my eyes couldn't reach. Shelves of products lined the walls, but the items on those shelves weren't normal. They were indistinct, fuzzy, like they weren't quite real or were existing in a slightly different dimension than I was. The old man locked the door behind me. "You've been running for a long time," he said. His voice sounded wrong, like it was coming from underwater or being played through a broken speaker. The dog doesn't usually take this long to collect someone. My blood went cold. Collect? I backed away from him, my hand reaching for the door. "What are you talking about?" The old man, his smile grew wider. "You saw the black dog of the Miramichi. You saw its eyes. Now it's marked you. Now you belong to it. The running, the terror, the endless escape. It is a game the dog plays. It lets you think you might survive. It lets you run and drive and hope. But you were already dead. You died the moment you locked eyes with it on that highway. I was shaking my head, refusing to listen. I grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't open. Behind the old man, I started to see shapes emerging from the shadows. Pale shapes, human-shaped, but not quite right. They were watching me with empty eyes. I pounded on the glass door. "Let me out! Let me out now!" The old man, his face was changing. His features were becoming indistinct, melting like wax. His smile was spreading impossibly wide across his face, and where his teeth had been, there was now nothing but a black void. I turned away from him and smashed the window with my fist. I didn't even feel the glass cutting into my hand. I reached through, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. I ran back to my car, not looking behind me, not wanting to see what was happening in that impossible building. I got in my car, started the engine, and peeled out of the gas station. In my rearview mirror, I saw the building collapse in on itself, folding like origami, disappearing into the darkness. From that point, my memory becomes fragmented. I remember driving. I remember the black dog appearing several times on the road ahead, forcing me to swerve into the forest. I remember the sound of it running behind my car, that deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I remember stopping my car at one point and seeing that my cell phone showed no signal, no time, nothing. Just a black screen, as if the technology had stopped working. I drove for hours, or was it days? Time felt strange and unreliable. The forest seemed to be moving around me, the highway twisting and turning in ways that didn't match any map I'd ever seen. I knew I should be back in Maine, back in the United States, but the road kept bringing me deeper into darkness. I remember passing other cars on the road, empty cars, driving slowly, with no one behind the wheel. I remember seeing things in the forest that looked almost human but weren't quite. I remember the overwhelming sense of being hunted, of being a prey animal fleeing a predator that would never get tired, never give up, and couldn't be outrun. At some point, I stopped running. I pulled my car off the road and sat in the darkness, completely exhausted, completely terrified, but no longer capable of moving. The black dog emerged from the forest and stood on the road in front of my car. We looked at each other, me and the creature that had been hunting me for what felt like an eternity. Those glowing eyes were ancient and knowing and utterly devoid of mercy. They burned with a hunger that wasn't about flesh or blood. It was a hunger for something deeper, a hunger for fear, for terror, for the breaking point of the human mind. And then I felt it, the sensation of being pulled, not physically, but spiritually, as if some fundamental part of me was being drawn toward the dog, as if my consciousness itself was being extracted from my body. I lost time after that. Days, weeks. I don't remember it clearly, but I do remember fragments. I remember being in the forest, running through endless trees with no destination. I remember the sounds of other people running too, their breathing synchronized with mine, but when I looked to my left or right, I saw no one. I remember the sensation of claws on my back, scratching, but when I looked in a mirror, I saw my skin was unmarked. I remember the taste of something thick and terrible in my mouth, something that might have been blood or might have been something else entirely. I remember the hunger, not hunger for food, but a deep, gnawing emptiness that consumed me from the inside. A hunger for light, for warmth, for anything that wasn't the fear and darkness and the endless chase. When I finally woke up in a hospital in Portland, Maine, the doctor said I'd been missing for 43 days. They said I was found wandering on Highway 2, delirious and suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition. I had scratches all over my body that I didn't remember getting. I lost 15 pounds. My hair had grown noticeably longer. My fingernails were cracked and split. They ran every test, CT scans, blood work, psychiatric evaluations. Everything came back normal. The doctors assumed I had some kind of mental breakdown and gone into the forest where I wandered for weeks, surviving on whatever I could find. They prescribed antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. They offered me therapy, but I know what happened. I know I went somewhere else, somewhere that exists just outside the edge of our reality, a place where the rules don't apply, a place where the black dog of the Miramichi hunts and plays its games with its prey. The scratches on my back healed, but I can still feel them sometimes. A phantom itch that reminds me that something has marked me, something has touched me, something owns a piece of my soul. I've been home for 3 months now. They tried to go back to my normal life. I go to work, I pay my bills, I see my friends and family. But nothing feels real anymore. The world feels like a thin veil stretched over something else, something darker, something that is always watching. The scariest thing they learned is that the black dog didn't just hunt me during those missing days. It's still hunting me now. Last night, I saw its eyes glowing in the shadows outside my window. This morning, there were fresh scratches on the glass. I'm writing this account now because do you know how much longer I have? The dog is patient. It likes to let its victims live with the terror, the knowledge of what is coming. But eventually, it will come for me. It will finish what it started. And I'll disappear again, permanently this time. The question I need to ask you, the person listening to this story, is this: have you ever seen a black dog with glowing eyes? Have you ever felt an overwhelming sense of dread for no reason? Have you ever found scratches on your window that you didn't make? If the answer is yes to any of these questions, then you need to understand something very important. The black dog of the Miramichi ISN, just a local legend in New Brunswick. It's something that hunts. It's something that travels. It's something that marked me. And now I'm marking you by telling you this story. You know, it exists now. You heard about its glowing eyes. You learned about its hunting. And that knowledge might be enough. It might be enough to make you see something in the shadows tonight. It might be enough to make you wonder about that scratching sound at your window. It might be enough to make the black dog take an interest in you. So here is my question for all of you listening right now. If you saw the black dog of the Miramichi with those terrifying, glowing eyes, what would you do? Would you run? Would you fight? Would you accept what I've come to believe, that some hunts end with the hunter always winning? Write your answers in the comments below. I want to know. I need to know that I'm not the only one who understands what is really out there. Story 8. Something in Uranium City. The windows were watching me. All of them. Hundreds of empty, dark windows in abandoned buildings staring down at the frozen street where I stood alone in the dying light. I had driven 8 hours into the remote Saskatchewan wilderness to reach Uranium City, and now, standing in the eerie silence of this atomic ghost town, I understood why the locals refused to come here after dark. Something was wrong with this place. Something that had nothing to do with radiation or economic collapse. Uranium City was built in the 1950s during the nuclear boom, when Canada was mining uranium for atomic weapons and power plants. At its peak, 5,000 people lived here, working the mines, raising families, building what they thought would be a permanent community in the frozen north. Then the mines closed. The company pulled out. The government relocated most residents. By the early 80s, Uranium City was essentially dead. Now fewer than 100 souls remain, scattered among the ruins like survivors of some apocalyptic event. I am a photojournalist documenting abandoned places across North America. Ghost towns, closed factories, forgotten amusement parks. I have seen decay in all its forms. But Uranium City was different from the moment I arrived. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very air resisted my presence. And everywhere I looked, those windows. Dark, empty, watching. The town sits on the shore of Lake Athabasca, accessible only by a long, deteriorating road that most people avoid. In winter, the isolation becomes absolute. The nearest city is hundreds of miles away. Cell service is non-existent. If something goes wrong out here, you are completely alone. That fact should have warned me away. But I needed the photographs. I needed to document this place before it crumbled completely into the wilderness. I started with the school, a 3-story building that once held classrooms full of children. Now it stood hollow, windows smashed, doors hanging open like broken jaws. Inside, desks remained in rows, as if students might return any moment. Textbooks lay scattered across floors. A chalkboard still showed a math lesson from decades ago. The abandonment was so sudden, so complete, it felt like everyone had simply vanished midday. That is when I found the warnings. Graffiti sprayed across the walls in every room. Not the usual tags or obscene drawings. These were messages, desperate messages. Do not stay after dark. It sees you. The radiation changed something. They are still here. The words were fresh, painted within the last few years. Someone had come here specifically to leave warnings for anyone foolish enough to follow. I photographed everything, telling myself it was just local legend, kids trying to scare each other. But my hands were shaking. The temperature inside the school felt wrong, colder than the winter air outside. And I kept hearing sounds, footsteps on the floor above me, Doors closing in empty hallways. The creak of old buildings settling, I told myself. Just the wind and decay. The residential area was worse. Street after street of abandoned homes, their contents left behind as if the occupants had fled in panic. Furniture in living rooms, clothes in closets, family photos still hanging on walls. In one house, I found a kitchen table set for dinner, plates covered in decades of dust. Food long since rotted away. What kind of emergency makes people leave without even clearing the table? Then I saw the basement doors. Every house I entered had a basement, and every basement door was sealed. Not locked, sealed. Boards nailed across the frames. Chains wrapped around handles. Some had concrete poured into the cracks. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure those basement doors could never be opened. And on many of them, more warnings were scratched into the wood. Stay out. Sealed for a reason. Contaminated. The official story says certain areas of Uranium City have elevated radiation levels from the mining operations. The contaminated soil, the groundwater, the very earth beneath the town carries traces of uranium and its decay products. Radon gas seeps up from below. It makes sense to seal contaminated spaces. But this felt different. This felt like fear, not safety protocol. Sunset came fast in the northern winter. The light bled from the sky, replaced by a darkness so complete it felt solid. I had planned to leave before nightfall, but I got turned around in the maze of identical streets. My GPS showed nothing but blank space. No roads, no landmarks, just my blue dot floating in emptiness. I was lost in a town of fewer than 100 people, and somehow that felt more terrifying than being lost in true wilderness. I took shelter in one of the more intact houses, a two-story home that still had most of its windows. I barricaded the front door, more out of instinct than rational thought. Who was I keeping out? The handful of remaining residents? Or something else? I set up my camera equipment, intending to document the interior in the morning light. Then I settled in to wait for dawn. The scratching started around midnight. Soft at first, coming from below, from the sealed basement. I stood frozen, listening to the sound of something dragging across concrete, scraping at the barrier between us. Then I heard the breathing. Slow, labored breathing that echoed through the house, this ventilation system. Something was down there. Something alive. I told myself it was an animal. A bear or wolf that had denned in the basement. But the scratching was too methodical, too purposeful, and the breathing sounded wrong, wet and gurgling, like lungs filled with fluid. The sound of someone drowning in air. Then came the voices, whispered words I could barely make out, filtering up through the floorboards. They spoke in tones that were almost human but not quite right. The rhythm was off, the pronunciation distorted, and they were speaking my name, over and over, calling me to come down, to open the door, to see what waited below. I grabbed my gear and ran, out the front door, into the frozen street, my breath tearing from my lungs in ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard the house come alive with sound, banging, crashing, the shriek of wood being torn apart. I did not look back. I just ran through the darkness, guided only by starlight reflected off snow. That is when I saw them, figures standing in the windows of every building, motionless silhouettes backlit by a faint, greenish glow that had no apparent source. Dozens of them, watching me run through their abandoned streets. Some stood in second-story windows, some in doorways, all perfectly still, all facing my direction, tracking my movement with their featureless heads. I found my truck through sheer luck, parked where I had left it near the old community center. I threw my equipment in the back and started the engine with shaking hands. The headlights swept across the street as I turned, illuminating a group of figures standing directly in my path. They were closer now, close enough to see details I wished I could unsee. Their skin had a waxy, translucent quality, as if radiation had somehow preserved them while simultaneously transforming them into something no longer fully human. Their eyes reflected the headlights with that same greenish glow, and their mouths hung open, frozen in expressions that could have been screams or hunger or both. I drove straight through them, or tried to. My truck passed through empty space where they had been standing, as if they were not truly physical, as if they existed in some state between solid and ethereal. But I felt them. The temperature plummeted as I passed through those forms. Frost instantly covered my windshield, and I heard their voices, dozens of voices, speaking in unison directly into my mind. Words I cannot fully remember, but that carried a terrible meaning. They were trapped, changed, and they wanted out. The drive back to civilization took 6 hours of white-knuckle terror. Every shadow looked like another figure, Every reflection in my mirrors showed something standing behind my truck. The GPS remained useless, showing only blank space, forcing me to navigate by instinct and memory through unfamiliar territory in total darkness. When I finally reached a town with people and lights and the blessed normalcy of a gas station, I pulled over and vomited in the parking lot. The attendant asked if I was okay. I could not answer. How could I explain what I had seen? How could I make anyone understand the horror of Uranium City? I developed my photographs when I got home. Most were normal shots of decay and abandonment. But in several images, if you look closely at the windows, you can see them. The figures, standing there, watching the camera. In one photo, taken inside the school, there are shapes in the hallway behind me that were not there when I took the shot. Translucent forms with those terrible glowing eyes. I researched the history after my experience. The official records mention nothing unusual, just mine closures and population decline. But I found references in old newspapers, stories the government had ignored or suppressed. Reports of workers who went into the deep mines and came back changed. Men who stopped eating, who stood at windows for hours, who spoke in voices that were not their own. Several workers simply vanished. Others died of unexplained illnesses that did not match radiation sickness. And I found references to something called the lower tunnels, sections of the mine that were sealed and flooded in the 70s after workers refused to go down there. They claimed something had been disturbed deep in the earth, something that had been buried for thousands of years beneath the uranium deposits, something that the radiation woke up or changed or allowed to manifest in our reality. The theory, as insane as it sounds, is that prolonged exposure to radiation in that specific geological formation did something to human tissue. Not just cancer, not just cell damage, but something that affected consciousness itself. Those figures I saw in the windows, those voices calling from sealed basements, they are what remains of people who were changed by their exposure. Trapped between life and death. No longer fully human but not quite dead either. Existing in some horrible middle state, forever bound to that contaminated soil. Uranium City still exists. The handful of residents still live there, though most refuse to discuss why they stay. The government monitors radiation levels but does not restrict access. You can drive there right now if you wanted. Walk those empty streets. Look into those dark windows. Enter those abandoned homes with their sealed basements. But I am telling you this as clearly as I can. Do not go there. Do not dismiss this as urban legend or exaggeration. Something exists in Uranium City that should not exist. Something that was born from human error and atomic contamination and the terrible things that happen when we dig too deep into places we do not understand. And it is still there, waiting, watching, growing stronger in the darkness. I still have nightmares about those figures in the windows. I wake up convinced I can hear scratching coming from below my own house, though I live in an apartment with no basement. And sometimes, in the moment between waking and sleeping, I hear them calling my name in those distorted voices, inviting me to return, to become one of them. So here's my question for you. If you had the chance to visit Uranium City, to see this atomic ghost town with your own eyes and maybe capture evidence of what lurks there, would you go? Would you risk an encounter with whatever was changed by that contaminated soil? Or would you trust the warnings scratched on basement doors and stay far away from that cursed place? Write your answer in the comments, because Uranium City is still there, still abandoned, still waiting. And in those empty windows, something is still watching, still hoping someone will come close enough, still hungry for whatever it is that the changed ones need from the living. Story 9. Toronto Airport Runway Entity. The figure was sprinting across runway 24L at full speed when I spotted it through my cockpit window, a humanoid shape moving impossibly fast through the darkness at 3 in the morning. I was the pilot who aborted my landing and filed the emergency report, but when security reviewed the thermal imaging cameras, they found nothing. No heat signature, no body temperature, just empty runway where something had definitely been running. This is my terrifying confession about the entity that haunts Toronto Pearson International Airport, and why I'll never fly the late shift again. This story is real, the incident reports are real, and the growing number of pilots who've seen this thing and quit their jobs is very, very real. What I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about one of the busiest airports in North America. They've been flying commercial aircraft for 19 years. They landed in thunderstorms, ice storms, and conditions that would make most people never want to fly again. I am trained to handle emergencies, trained to stay calm when things go wrong. But nothing in my training prepared me for what I saw that night or for the conspiracy of silence that followed. It was a Wednesday in late November. I was bringing a 737 in from Chicago, scheduled to land at Toronto Pearson at 3:14 in the morning. Late flights like this are routine. The airport never really sleeps, but it gets quieter after midnight. Fewer planes, less radio chatter, just the hum of engines and the glow of runway lights in the darkness. We were on final approach, maybe 800 feet above the ground, when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a vehicle on the runway, a maintenance truck that hadn't cleared in time. But as we descended, I realized it wasn't a vehicle. It was moving on two legs, running, and it was moving faster than any human being possibly could. I hit the throttle and pulled up, executing a go-around maneuver while radioing the tower. Told them there was someone on the runway. My co-pilot saw it too. We both watched this thing sprint from one side of the massive runway to the other, covering maybe 200 yards in what felt like seconds. Then it just vanished. Not ran out of sight. Vanished. There one moment. Gone the next, like someone had flipped a switch. The tower said their cameras showed nothing. No person, no vehicle, no obstruction of any kind. But they closed the runway as a precaution and sent security to investigate. We circled for 20 minutes while they searched. They found nothing. No footprints. No tire tracks. No evidence anything had been on that runway. We finally landed on a different runway. I filed my incident report, including everything I'd seen. The co-pilot filed his own report, backing up my account. We were both experienced pilots with spotless safety records. Not the kind of guys who see things that aren't there. But the airport authority treated us like they imagined it. Stress, fatigue, the darkness playing tricks on our eyes. Except we hadn't imagined anything. And we weren't the first to see it. I started asking around, talking quietly to other pilots, and I learned that sightings of the runway entity had been happening for at least 5 years. Always at night, always on the runways or taxiways. Always the same description, a humanoid figure moving at inhuman speed, then disappearing without a trace. Dozens of pilots had seen it. Some had filed reports. Others kept quiet, afraid of losing their medical certificates if they admitted to seeing impossible things. One pilot, a guy named Marcus, who had been flying for 30 years, told me he'd seen the entity 3 times. The last time, it had been running directly at his aircraft during takeoff. He'd been accelerating down the runway at over 100 miles per hour when this thing appeared from nowhere and sprinted straight at his nose gear. He braced for impact, certain they were going to hit it. But at the last second, it vanished, just ceased to exist in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Marcus quit flying after that, took early retirement. He told me the entity wasn't just some visual anomaly. It was intelligent. It was choosing to appear, and it was testing them, seeing how they react, building up to something worse. I wanted to dismiss his paranoia, but then I saw it again, 2 weeks after my first sighting. Same runway, same time of night. This time I was taxiing after landing, moving slowly toward the gate. The entity appeared about 50 yards ahead of my aircraft, just materialized on the taxiway like it had been there all along. It stood perfectly still for maybe 5 seconds, long enough for me to get a clear look at it. It was roughly human-shaped, maybe 7 feet tall, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, and it had no face. Not like it was wearing a mask, more like the head was completely smooth. No features at all, just a blank, oval surface that somehow faced directly at my cockpit window. Directly at me. Then it moved. Not running this time, just turned and walked away with a fluid, gliding motion that made my stomach turn. It crossed the taxiway and stepped into the darkness beyond the lights. And again, it vanished. Security cameras reviewed later showed nothing but empty pavement. That is when I started digging into the airport, its history, looking for accidents, deaths, anything that might explain a haunting. And I found something the airport authority had buried deep in their archives. Something they worked very hard to keep quiet. In 2009, a ground crew worker named David Chen disappeared while working the overnight shift. He'd been doing a routine inspection of runway 24L when he simply vanished. His equipment was found near the center line, his radio still on, but David was gone. They searched for weeks, checked every building, every vehicle, every inch of the airport grounds. No trace, no body, no explanation. The investigation eventually concluded he walked away. Personal problems, they said. Started a new life somewhere else. But his family never believed it. David loved his job, had no reason to disappear, and his daughter told me something the official report never mentioned. In the weeks before he vanished, David had been reporting strange sightings. A figure on the runways that shouldn't be there. Something that appeared and disappeared without warning. He filed multiple reports. All of them were dismissed. I think David saw the entity. I think it took him. And I think the airport knows exactly what is happening but can acknowledge it, because admitting they have a supernatural predator stalking their runways would destroy them. They have to shut down, reroute hundreds of flights, cost billions in lost revenue. So instead, they suppress reports, intimidate witnesses, and hope the entity doesn't de-escalate beyond terrorizing pilots. But it is escalating. The sightings are becoming more frequent, more aggressive. Last month, a cargo pilot reported the entity standing in the middle of the runway during landing, forcing him to abort. 3 days later, it appeared inside the terminal building. A cleaning crew saw it walk through a solid wall near gate E47. One woman quit on the spot. The others were told they imagined it. Gas leak, the airport said. Hallucinations from carbon monoxide exposure, even though the air quality monitors showed nothing wrong. They've seen it 4 times now, each encounter more disturbing than the last. The most recent was 2 nights ago. I was in the cockpit doing pre-flight checks, parked at the gate. It was 4 in the morning. The terminal was mostly empty. I happened to glance out the window at the jetway connecting the plane to the gate. The entity was there, standing at the far end of the jetway, looking directly at me through that blank, featureless head. We stared at each other for maybe 30 seconds. Then it turned and walked into the terminal, through a locked door, just passed through the solid metal like it was mist. I am leaving the airline, filing my resignation this week, because I know what happens to people who see the entity too many times. David Chen saw it repeatedly and disappeared. Other ground crew workers have gone missing over the years. 3 in total. All of them reported seeing something strange on the runways before they vanished. The pattern is clear. The entity marks people, appears to them again and again, and eventually it takes them. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's David Chen, this ghost, transformed into something terrible. Maybe it's something older that was always there, living in the spaces between the runways, and David was just its first victim. Or maybe it's something that came from somewhere else entirely. Something that found a home in the endless movement and machinery of a major airport. A place where thousands of people pass through every day, but no one really belongs. A liminal space where reality is thin. Whatever it is, Toronto Pearson Airport is not safe. The entity is real. It's documented in dozens of incident reports that the airport buries in classified files. It has been seen by experienced professionals who have no reason to lie. And it's getting bolder, moving from the empty runways into the terminal itself, getting closer to the thousands of passengers who have no idea what stalks them. I am telling this story because people deserve to know, because the next pilot who sees it might not be as lucky as I was, because the entity is hunting, and eventually it will catch someone. Maybe it already has. Maybe there are people missing from Toronto Pearson that we don't even know about yet. Passengers who wandered down the wrong corridor late at night. Employees who stayed after their shift and saw something they shouldn't have. If you fly through Toronto Pearson, especially late at night, stay alert. Don't to wander the terminals alone. Don't to look too closely at the shadows near the windows. And if you see a tall, humanoid figure with no face watching you from the darkness, get somewhere public immediately. Because the entity is real. It is hunting, and no amount of security cameras or thermal imaging can protect you from something that doesn't register as human. Something that can disappear between heartbeats and walk through walls and sprint across runways at impossible speeds. I have submitted my final flight report. After 19 years, I am walking away from the career I love, because I'd rather be unemployed than become the next person who disappears into whatever darkness the entity came from. The next name on a list of unsolved missing persons at Toronto Pearson refuses to connect. The runway entity is still there, right now, waiting in the darkness between the lights, watching the planes land and take off, marking its next victim, and the airport will keep operating, keep denying, keep burying the truth, until something happens that's too big to hide, until the entity takes someone important enough that the world demands answers. I just hope I'm far away when that day comes.